Now, one of the things I find interesting in this is you focused a lot on television advertising. But I did read recently that industry is also working a lot in other mobile media these days, with websites, with smartphones. Can you provide us any information about how that's affecting marketing? Is that being monitored at all within your studies or other people's studies?
Not by myself, but others, and it's very important that they do so. The television is so familiar to us, and we know how to measure what's going on. Internet websites are much more difficult to keep track of. In fact, the advertising industry refers to it as the Wild, Wild West. I mentioned earlier there are limits on the amount of time that you can have ads in a children's television program. There not only are no limits on the amount of time that you can have advertising or the number of pages that you can have advertising on an internet site, but the food manufacturers now are establishing their own unique sites that are essentially 100% advertising. They're child targeted, they have adver games. McDonald's has roughly a dozen child-targeted websites. Some are targeted at very young children, almost infants, others at elementary school age, others at teens. And they have adver games where the children can play all sorts of interactive games that sort of keep them on the website while orienting them to the product. I remember the first one that I ever saw was for Slam Dunk Oreos. Well, what they want to do is just keep the attention on the product and get that sort of primed in the child's memory. That increases the chance they're going to ask for it when they go to the store with mom and dad.
So that the Slam Dunk Oreos also brings up the issue about when children watch TV, it's not just advertisements that they're getting exposed to when they look at food. There's other things with food on television shows.
Sure.
I know that you've spoken to me about this before. Can you talk about how we can help maybe educate children to understand what they're watching when they see a TV show and someone's on the couch and they're eating certain foods? And there's obviously lots of product placement in TV these days too.
Right, right. Well, there's two terms that are relevant here. One I know you're familiar with, and that's health literacy, and that's what the School of Public Health here at the University of Arizona is interested in doing. They're training public health professionals to improve the health literacy of the average citizen. In my field of communication, there's another term we use called media literacy. And this is where you're trying to teach children to be more sophisticated consumers of the media content that they receive. So you can train children, for example, at certain ages that people don't really die on television. They're just actors, and after the scene is over, they get up and walk away. But you can't do that with a very young child. You can only because they're confused about the distinctions between fantasy and reality. In the area of advertising, what we would want to do is we'd want to train children to understand persuasive intent, to understand that if someone's trying to persuade them, they need to be more skeptical. They need to be more critical in evaluating the information in an ad. But that's hard to do when a child is below the age of 8 and they lack the cognitive ability to take the perspective of another person. They're just not built, their brains are not wired to do that yet. They lack the ability to understand abstract concepts like motives and intentions that you have to appreciate to understand an advertiser's persuasive intent. And so while we can accelerate what children can do a little bit, I can't, no matter how much I try and have the most elaborate program of media literacy, I can't make a child below about 7 to 8 years of age really any more effective in defending against commercial persuasion.
Now, the age group 8, so that's about second grade or so.
Yeah, second to third possibly, grade. Depending. Yeah.
Are there things that we can develop for schools that can help integrate this into curriculum for students so they can become more aware of what's happening, so it kind of meets maybe our school standards, which we have to meet still because curriculum are packed these days.
Right.
But it seems to me that we do lots of school programs for nutrition, both physical activity, we teach them about calories, we tell them what, we have food lunch programs. But I'm not sure what's been developed in the school level to teach children how to understand what they're watching.
Well, there are some model programs that are trying to promote advertising defense, and one of the things that they do is they have children actually create their own ads so that they play the role of a food marketer or an advertiser, and then they try to talk through how would you make money by getting more people to see your ad and to like your product and to buy your product. But as you say, that's only going to happen not only with older children, but also in a school district that's very well resourced, because then you'd have to have some sort of at least rudimentary cameras and production equipment and so forth.
That's interesting. The definitely children can role play very well, and that's a good way to learn.
The older ones, yes.
Yes. The younger children, how come the food marketing goes to them, but it's the parents who do all the shopping?
Well, that's the $64 million question. In fact, the policy debate here, and I'm sure that some in our audience are going to respond with a question along these lines. They're going to say, well, you know, what's the problem with food advertising targeted at children? The children, if you're a 7-year-old, you're not going down to the Safeway, you're not making a purchase of your sugared cereals and sugared drinks with your credit card and then taking home and eating them. It's mom and dad who are making these decisions. Well, that's fair, and I understand that parents have a critical role to play here, but the people like your audience who are interested in public health know what it means to say we live in an obesogenic environment. We live in a world where it's hard to make the right choices. We live in a world where it's hard for a parent to tell their child no when their child is seeing 15 messages a day that are promoting unhealthy food products to them. What I say to the advertising industry is, if you want to use as a defense that it's the parents that are making these choices, and so we really shouldn't have any limits on unhealthy food marketing to kids, I say, if it's the parents making the decisions, why aren't you targeting the ads at the parents? Why are you targeting the young children who are the most vulnerable? But I believe I know the answer, and that's because it's like shooting fish in a barrel. It's basically easy to persuade young children to want these products, to beg their parents for these products. They're priming these kids for lifetime eating habits. As a nutritionist, you know that habits that are developed early in life often persist. And so if you can orient a child to eat sugared cereal every morning, you're going to make a lot of money over the years of your Kellogg's or General Mills or one of these companies.
Can you see what role do you see governmental agencies have in food marketing in general? There's lots of information about regulating the amount of ads. There's talk about taxing high sugared foods and high fat foods. From a communications perspective, what are the types of things that would get people to change behavior if the government's going to take a stronger stance in trying to decrease obesity in the U.S.?
Right. Well, it's a terrific question, and it's quite a controversial area. One of the things that's been talked about in the United States is a restriction on unhealthy food advertising to children. That's already being tried in several other countries. England is the most prominent, and England has adopted a restriction that you cannot air what they call an HFSS food. That's high in fat, salt, and sugar. It's what the layperson would call junk food. You can't air an ad for a junk food during a program that has an audience of, I believe it's around 25% or more children. So that would mean any general audience-oriented show like The Simpsons that gets a lot of child viewers, or any child-oriented program. And so that's also being adopted in Ireland, it's being considered in Australia, and it's being talked about here, which is why the industry has been so active in lobbying against these even voluntary guidelines for fear that they might then somehow transit into actual regulatory guidelines. I just authored an article, or co-authored an article in Health Affairs a month or two ago, where I worked with 2 public interest lawyers and made the argument that the First Amendment would allow that type of regulation. The food industry says, well, we have freedom of speech. First Amendment guarantees freedom of speech, no government law can restrict anybody's what they say and in the media and so forth. And so the food industry says government couldn't adopt that law. Maybe they can do it in the UK where they don't have a First Amendment, but probably not here in the US. it turns out that there's a lot of Supreme Court precedent that establishes that advertising that is misleading can be regulated by the government. It's what they call a balancing test or a balancing approach. And based on the research that I briefly mentioned in my intro, but I've basically been working in this area for many, many years. There's really compelling evidence that children in the younger years are misled by advertising, all advertising, because they don't understand the persuasive intent of it. And so we argue that you could have that type of a regulation, and then, if that's correct, it becomes a values question. And the values question is, do you want to protect the big food conglomerates' right to spend what they currently spend, estimated about $15 billion a year, to promote unhealthy food products to kids? Do you want to protect that right, or do you want to balance it in some way by allowing the government to do something to limit children's exposure to these unhealthy food ads so that they're not constantly primed when they're hungry to think about eating these unhealthy snack foods? Now that's a long answer, to your question, but it didn't do justice to another element of your question, and that is, could we tax foods that are heavy contributors to obesity and have little nutritional value? And the test case for that, of course, is sugared sweetened beverages. Sugar sweetened beverages, like your sodas, have as many or more calories than an average candy bar. There's several cubes of sugar in every 12-ounce drink. People that drink the couple a day are at really high risk of obesity, and the sad part is that it's contributing nothing in terms of nutrition to your daily diet. So it's what a lot of nutritionists refer to as empty calories. Seems like that would be the perfect target for a tax where, fine, we believe in personal choice, just like with smoking. You want to smoke, there are societal costs. So you pay a tax, and then that tax money goes back to help the country address the societal costs with the healthcare industry and so much of the public funding healthcare or medical coverage for victims of smoking. You would have the same situation for sugar-sweetened beverages, but right now the food industry is fighting that proposal aggressively, and so far they've won every battle.
What got researchers or people looking at this relationship between advertising and food marketing? Does it come from our experience with tobacco and alcohol, or is it or was there some other effect that occurred? Usually there's a sentinel event, and then people say we need to do something.
Yeah.
Can you give us maybe a little bit of a historical perspective about how we all are now focusing on marketing as one of the factors, not the only factor,
right?
But one of the factors that might lead to obesity in our children.
Right. Well, I'll try. This is using my Ouija board sort of to interpret history, but as you imply in your question, there are so many diverse factors that contribute to obesity. The easy availability of fast food restaurants, the lack of physical activity, both for the younger children in schools and the average adult in desk jobs and so forth. A lot of people point to the fact that there are reduced family meals. When one of the parents prepare a meal and everyone eats together, they tend to eat more healthfully. So all of those are factors. And when the obesity crisis first came on the public radar in the early 2000s, and Richard Carmona, then Surgeon General, indicated that this could be the first generation of children that ever would have a shorter life expectancy than that of their parents. Well, everybody woke up and said, what can we do? And the answer is there's no one solution. There are so many threads in this fabric that we've got to look at all of the possible environmental factors and try to find places we can make changes. People thought of this area, food marketing to children, as one where the government could be involved or the media industries could be involved, and you could have what you might say would be a small effect on a very large number of people, as opposed to, here I'm working in a sedentary job, I need to exercise. Well, that could be a big effect on a small number of people, me. But to have a small effect, imagine if we could reduce the amount of unhealthy food advertising that every child in America, or every child in the state of Arizona saw for the next year, that we could reduce that by a quarter. Well, how is that going to affect their consumption of unhealthy foods? It's going to suppress them. It's probably, it doesn't mean kids are not going to want or eat junk foods anymore, but it's going to prime them less. The cues and so forth are not going to be as common, as prominent. And if we could have that effect on every child in America, and even it's a small suppressing effect, well, that could have a really profound and positive impact on the obesity crisis at a population level. And so I think people focused on this as an area where it just doesn't make sense. Why are we promoting the foods that are most unhealthy as one of the most common types of ads that kids see? It doesn't make sense from an ethical perspective, from a moral perspective, given that children are so vulnerable to these. And then when you think about the positive impact that can have on the obesity crisis, I think that's the reason that people turn to this. And it's a big battleground.
You know, I read that just the fast food industry, not even the snack food industry or other, spends more than $4 billion with a B on advertising. I'm sure that our public health system doesn't even spend a tenth of that on promoting healthy behaviors and healthy. Is there, quantity means something, right? It's not just the quality of the message, but
Sure.
having quantity and being hit multiple times has just as much effect or is equal to some of the quality of the science that we have on how to communicate with people.
Right. Well, you know, the public service campaigns are terrific, but a child sees about 75 ads for an unhealthy food product for every one ad they see for a healthy food product. Well, I'm going to guess a child sees about 1,000 food ads before they see a healthy eating public service announcement. I mean, the ratio for those makes them so modest that they can't really compete in the marketplace where a child is constantly bombarded by these messages. And that's unfortunate. I mean, what this really boils down to is the fact that the advertisers are not throwing their money away. You said the fast food industry spends $4 billion a year. I said the overall unhealthy, the food companies that are marketing unhealthy products to children are spending about $15 billion a year. And so they're not, I mean, these are shrewd business people. They're not throwing their money away. When they put those ads out there, it increases their sales, it increases their profits. They're getting money back on every dollar they invest in advertising. And unfortunately, the public sector just doesn't have the resources to kind of compete in that type of an environment.
When Healthy People 2000, maybe even Healthy People 1990 came out, one of the first goals was to increase the number of low-fat items in the supermarket. That goal was met by industry not in 10 years, but in 3 or 4 years. So industry can change very quickly to meet a market demand. Are you seeing any changes within what fast foods and food industry is doing to sort of have healthier products out there?
Well, I'm a little, I'll give you my answer, but I'll qualify it by noting that you're asking for my personal opinion here, and I feel a lot better when I can report the data since I'm trained as a scientist. But my general impression is that the food industry likes to make noises that they're offering healthy products, but they don't back it up with their marketing muscle. Well, let me explain what I mean by that. They offer salads at McDonald's. How often do you see an ad for the salad that McDonald's offers? How prominently do you see it featured on their in-store displays? The reason they don't give it marketing muscle is their product, or what would you call it, their profit margin is more modest. They make more money selling you a hamburger than they make selling you a salad. If they'd rather sell you a salad than have you go down the street and eat somewhere else. But they're going to try to make the most profits that they can. And so I really genuinely believe if the fast food restaurants all went to salad bars and promoted salad bars, it would change the basic diet of Americans within a matter of just a year or two. It would take a little time, but you may think that these ads don't persuade you. In fact, there's this the research shows there's this third person effect where people say, well, the ads affect other people, but they don't really affect me. Well, they do affect you. They affect the way you think about what is normative and what most people are doing. And consumers want to be in the mainstream. Typically, they want to feel like I'm a part of society and I'm participating. And that's what advertising does to it. Is you might call it brainwashing, but it absolutely influences our behavior very profoundly.
How can we educate parents on media literacy? What type of maybe public health, given that this is public health, what type of public health campaigns and what, elevator speech or 30-second sound bite might we be able to put out there to educate parents?
Well, parents, where I'm pausing here is that media literacy, to be effective, has to be done in a rather systematic fashion. I mean, just like you wouldn't say to parents, well, why don't we have parents teach children American history? Well, we do it in the schools because we want to have it be a regular curriculum. We want to build and use building blocks in certain ways. And so when I think of media literacy, I think what we need to do is to get it into the schools. And so here, what I would love to see is to have parents contact their school board. In fact, parents are typically comprise the school board, and so make that something that your local community is sensitive to about integrating into your curriculum for your child. And of course it can start at a young age, but it's not until the later elementary years that you can effectively teach children to defend against commercial persuasion. So parents, as far as their independent resources, they could go online, look at places like Center for Media Literacy, which is a well-established resource that has some guidebooks and things that you can either download or possibly purchase. I'm not sure. They're a nonprofit, but there are some good resources there that could be helpful.
That's really interesting. We just finished the Public Health Training Center, a 2-day curriculum we have for parent ambassadors that help schools create school wellness plans. And I could see that we could talk about wellness plans, including media literacy, which then is related to food marketing.
Yeah, they're very complementary.
And that can definitely meet, because these are standards and requirements of schools. They have to have wellness plans. And I think that's a good suggestion, is that we make media literacy a part of those wellness plans.
Sure. One of the things they could do is just have your child start to pay attention to how many ads they see for unhealthy food products. Maybe even make it something that you try to sensitize your child to, so that they could count up and see, well, I am being influenced because I see so many of these.
All sorts of homework. They could stay at home. Little children could just count the number of ads that they watch, and as you get older, your homework assignments become more sophisticated.
Yes.
Are there ways that you see that we can work with industry to meet them halfway? Are there, on the Institute of Medicine committee, were there some of the recommendations you have, so there has to be some compromise sometime along the way? And what were some of those halfway points that you thought have been successful or could be successful?
Well, there are a number of public health groups like Center for Science of the Public Interest and medical professional groups like American Academy of Pediatrics that are really trying to do just that. What they're doing is they're looking at the CFBAI, that's that Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative that I talked about earlier, and they're saying, we need the industry to define healthy foods in a more valid and appropriate way. There's something wrong when the industry says they're advertising healthy foods, and then I can come along and do a research study that shows, applying government standards, 3 out of 4 of the foods the industry says are healthy, well, they're not, according to these government standards. So they're negotiating with the industry, and they're trying to get them to apply more stringent criteria to define a food as a healthy product. And I think that, that has some prospects. But it's a constant battle. The industry will push back a little, and then the advocacy groups don't have any leverage because if what are they gonna say if you don't give us what we want? What are we gonna do? Well, they can't regulate them. That would have to be the government. So it has some potential, but it hasn't really proven as successful as one would hope so far.
Okay. What's the best age to start educating kids on how to understand what they're watching? You mentioned 8 years of age. Is that?
If you try before 8, you're really not going to have much prospect of success. The child at that stage is just too egocentric, and when they see a sugared cereal ad, what it triggers in their mind is, boy, that would be good for me to eat. When a child is between 8 and about 10 years of age, that's a window where they're now reducing their egocentrism, they can take into account perspectives of others, they're becoming more adept at dealing with abstract motives and intentions. They're trying to persuade me. And so 8 to 10 would be the earliest age where you could see some good outcomes. And then beyond 10 on up around 12 in the later elementary years, that's the age where you would ideally target them with this link of both health literacy training as well as media literacy training, because then they can get excited about the concept. They can understand that advertisers are trying to manipulate, trying to exploit them, and they're excited because they understand this and they feel like they can apply it in their world.
I think we have time for one more question, and it comes around this idea about schools. If schools are the places to reach children, to have them change their behaviors as children, but also as when they become adults, we also have lots of influence still with marketing in the schools. Food marketing is occurring at the school level too, not just on television. Are there going to be problems with having curriculum get regulated by industry instead of being regulated by the parents themselves? If a food industry, a soda industry offers a school district $1 million to make sure all their soda machines have their product in it, is the next step saying these are the things we have to start teaching at the same time?
Well, this is a sad topic, and there is marketing in the schools primarily because the schools are not adequately funded. What's happened is in the last decade or so, when so many budget cuts have afflicted the school districts, well, principals have tried to be creative and look for alternative sources of revenue, and it's typically the case in the last 10, 15 years when marketing really became pervasive in the schools, that it wasn't school boards that were making these decisions. There wasn't a mass policy decision that we're going to allow all of this into our classrooms, but rather each individual principal who's thinking, well, what are the things I need to buy and I don't have a budget for? And then Pepsi comes along, or some of these food companies come along, and they say, well, if you'll let us put posters in the classroom or put our name on the scoreboard or whatever it might be, we can write you a check for $10,000, $20,000. And then, so what happened is then marketers got their foothold into the schools. Now it's a real difficult battle to get marketing out of the schools. But we're having the best success when we say, if we're going to allow marketing in the schools, we certainly shouldn't be allowing marketing for foods that are unhealthy when they're consumed on a regular basis. Sugar-sweetened beverages, candies, and so on. And so this is a battle, but because school control is at the local level, it's a battle that has to be fought over and over and over and over. There's no federal policy on marketing in the schools. And there are some school districts that are going so far as to sell billboards on the sides of school buses. They're so hard up for revenue. So it's so sad that we don't fund our schools better, but it doesn't, in my view, I just don't see how it's appropriate to sell our children to advertisers to fund the schools, especially when we know that younger children are uniquely vulnerable to the commercials.
Yeah, this has been a long time issue with school meals programs and where they can have competitive foods while they're serving lunch And can other people still sell their other foods at the same time? So it's competing
Right.
against the national food
Right.
programs. I mean, and there's been times where they've been regulated, they can't, and then there's times when they can. And it seems to always be a cycle. So maybe the cycle will switch soon where these advertisements are linked to funding or policy at the federal level too.
Right. You sure hope so.
This is the end of our webinar. I want to thank Dr. Kunkel for being here with us. He brings almost 30 years of expertise looking at media. He's looked at food over the last decade, but he's also looked at other issues of television's influence on adolescence, of health, and violence specifically. So he definitely understands how TV influences children's behavior. And so I'm very happy that you spent this time with us.